Imagine a winter night so quiet that even the mountains seem afraid to breathe. High on White Rock Ridge, a storm is rising, a storm so fierce it will change the life of one man forever. In the middle of that blinding snow, a forgotten car waits on an empty road, and beneath a frozen culvert, two tiny heartbeats are fading. When Sergeant Evan Mercer arrives, he believes he is answering a routine call. Instead, he steps into a moment that will rewrite his entire winter and awaken a miracle no one on the mountain could explain. As you listen to this journey of courage and compassion, tell me where you are watching from. I would love to see how far this story travels. And if you enjoy stories of hope, loyalty, and second chances, please press subscribe to support the channel so we can continue bringing you more heartfelt tales. The blizzard over White Rock Ridge had swallowed the town of Coldest whole. Streetlights were nothing but hazy coins behind curtains of snow. The mountains that usually stood like dark guardians above the valley had vanished into a shifting wall of white. Wind came down in long, angry gusts, slamming into pine forests and clapboard houses, turning every road into a narrow tunnel of swirling flakes. On nights like this, people with sense stayed home. The hospital lights still burned, the all-night diner on Main kept its coffee pots going, and in the sheriff's office a handful of dispatchers hunched over radios and glowing screens. Out in it, alone on Red Summit Road, was Sergeant Evan Mercer. Evan was 37 and built like a man who had spent most of his adult life in armor of one kind or another. He was tall and broad through the chest, but there was a quiet precision to his movements, a soldier's economy that made him seem smaller until he stepped out of a vehicle and unfolded to his full height. His dark hair was kept short from old army habit, with a streak of gray at his right temple that caught the light and made him look a little older than his years. His nose had clearly been broken once and never quite reset perfectly straight. His jaw tended to lock when he was concentrating, and a permanent shadow of stubble clung to his cheeks. What people remembered, though, were his eyes, a cool gray color that seemed to record everything and reveal almost nothing. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, packed it away neatly somewhere behind his ribs, and kept showing up anyway. Years in uniform, first the military, then the sheriff's office, had taught him not to flinch when things went bad. A hostage call on another winter road had taken his partner Leo and left a fault line running silently through his life. Evan did not talk about that night. He simply answered the radio every time it called. Tonight it had called about an abandoned vehicle near mile marker 14 on Red Summit Road, the narrow strip of asphalt carved into the side of White Rock Ridge. The road had a reputation for eating cars whenever the weather turned ugly and blurred the line between pavement and sky. Evan's cruiser climbed steadily through the drifting snow, chains biting, engine grumbling. The world beyond the windshield shrank to the shaky cone of his headlights and the occasional ghost of a pine trunk sliding past. Unit 3, how's your visibility? The dispatcher's voice crackled, thin with static. Hannah was on nights again. He could picture her up there in the warm office, ponytail, coffee mug, eyes on the radar. Dropping, he replied, leaning forward as if another inch would let him see more. I'm maybe a mile out. Copy. Weather Service just upgraded this band to severe whiteout. We're recalling everyone else. Everyone but me, he said, a dry thread of humor weaving through the words. If Hannah smiled, the storm swallowed the sound. Snow swept past the headlights in wild sideways sheets. Then a shape materialized ahead where there should have been nothing but white, a dark, wrong angle in the blur, and his gut tightened even before his brain finished labeling it. He eased off the gas and rolled up behind the stranded sedan. The car sat at an odd angle, rear tires half off the road, nose dipped toward the drainage ditch, driver's door hanging open as if someone had stepped out mid-thought and forgotten to close it. Snow already clung to the side panels and balanced along the mirrors. The taillights were dark. Evan left his own lights on, engine idling, and stepped out into the wind. The cold hit him like a physical slap, burning his cheeks and needling exposed skin. He moved first to the sedan, sweeping his flashlight over the interior. Front seats, back seats, floor, empty. No driver slumped over the wheel, no injured passenger sprawled across the upholstery. A to-go coffee cup sat abandoned in the console, its lid slightly popped where expanding ice had cracked it, the contents frozen solid. A phone charger dangled with no phone attached. The keys were gone. Snow had begun to fill the footprints leading away from the open door, but they were still visible, a messy trail sliding down the embankment toward the ditch that paralleled the road. Evan crouched, one gloved hand resting on the cold metal of the car as he studied the prints. They were close together and angled, as if the person making them had been hurrying and not entirely sure of their footing. His instincts prickled in that familiar, unwelcome way. He radioed in the plate, got back a name he didn't recognize, and no report of anyone missing, then followed the trail down the slope, boots crunching through crusted snow, flashlight beam cutting through the white. "Sheriff's office!" he called, raising his voice above the wind. "If you can hear me, call out." No one answered. The only sounds were the roar of the storm and the dull gurgle of half-frozen water moving somewhere deep inside the culvert that carried runoff under the road. For a few seconds, there was nothing else. Then a sound slipped under the wind, thin and shaky and easy to miss. A small, breathy whimper, too faint to belong to an adult and too desperate to be the wind alone. Evan stopped and listened, turning his head slightly like a hunting dog catching a scent. There it was again, coming from the shadowed mouth of the culvert. He slid the last few feet down, snow scraping at his shins, and angled his light into the opening. At the far back, jammed against the concrete wall, lay a burlap feed sack. The woven fabric was dark with damp, one side crusted over with ice, the top twisted and knotted shut with a length of baling twine. The entire bag shuddered as another thin sound leaked out. Evan's jaw tightened. He dropped to one knee, feeling the cold soak instantly through his uniform pant leg, and leaned into the culvert. With one hand braced on the icy concrete, he grabbed at the knot with the other. The twine was stiff and unyielding from the cold, but it finally gave way with a sharp snap. The sack sagged open. 2 German shepherd puppies spilled partly into his lap, limp and frighteningly light, as if someone had scooped the weight out of them and filled the space with frost. They were maybe 8 weeks old, all paws and ears and unsteady angles. The larger pup had the classic black and tan coat, though the tan was dulled by grime and frost, and his ears seemed to be holding an argument with gravity, not quite up, not quite down. The shape of his head hinted at the solid, blocky adult he would grow into one day. A dog meant to stand between danger and the people he loved. The smaller pup's frame was finer, ribs faintly visible under the matted fur, paws almost dainty beside his brother's. Ice crystals clung to his whiskers and between his toes. In good light, his eyes would probably be a warm amber. Right now they were only slitted, glassy with exhaustion and cold. The larger pup managed a thin, hoarse whine when Evan moved him. The smaller made no sound, just shivered occasionally in tiny, jerking bursts. His breath so shallow, Evan had to watch for them. Someone had tied this sack, shoved it into the culvert, and walked away, leaving the storm to finish the job. The knowledge slid into Evan's chest like a blade in the cold, sharp, precise, almost clean. Anger came in its wake, not the wild kind that made a man shout, but the hard, quiet kind that made him decide. "Hey," he said, his voice dropping into a low, steady tone he had once used for bleeding soldiers on hot, dusty roads an ocean away. "Stay with me, okay? I've got you." He shrugged out of his heavy outer jacket, ignoring the way the wind instantly knifed through his uniform shirt, and tucked both puppies against his chest. Their fur was wet and bitterly cold, smelling of straw and fear. He wrapped the jacket around them, pulling it tight until they were just 2 small noses poking out against his chest. One of them twitched, a paw pressing weakly against him. It felt like a tiny, insistent question. He answered by getting to his feet. The climb back up the embankment was slow and careful, every step chosen so he would not slip and send himself and his fragile cargo sliding back into the ditch. Snow pushed at his legs, the wind shoving at his back as if the storm itself wanted him to fail. By the time he reached the road, his fingers ached and his cheeks burned, but the small bodies inside his jacket still moved. The radio at his shoulder crackled. "Unit 3, status." Hannah's voice rode the static, sharper now, with louder background noise behind her. Evan adjusted his hold on the bundled pups before keying his mic. "Vehicle's empty," he said. "No driver on scene. I found 2 canines in distress, German shepherd puppies, hypothermic. But alive. Copy, Hannah replied. Be advised, visibility is reported near zero on Red Summit. Highway Patrol recommends all remaining units return to base. Nearest heated shelter to your position is Briar's Outpost, 5 miles downhill. Briar's Outpost. Even without seeing it, Evan could picture the low, stubborn building hugging a curve in the road. The old neon sign over the door buzzing defiantly against the dark, windows fogged by heat and breath. A wood stove in the corner, burning hot enough that customers shed their coats within minutes. And behind the counter, most nights stood Martha Briar. Martha was in her early 60s, short and square-shouldered, with the solid build of someone who had spent a lifetime throwing hay bales and hauling feed sacks almost as big as she was. Her hair had gone fully silver long ago, and usually escaped whatever clip she tried to restrain it with, forming a wild halo around a face seamed by years of squinting into snow and smiling at other people's stories. Her eyes were a clear, sharp mountain blue, quick to narrow at nonsense, and just as quick to soften around anything hurt. In her younger days, before she sold off most of the family ranch and turned the outpost into a cafe and gas stop, she had been the unofficial animal medic for half the ridge. Neighbors called Martha when a foal came early, or a ranch dog crawled home torn and limping. Long nights in drafty barns taught her just how thin the line between life and death could be, and how stubborn you sometimes had to be to drag a creature back across it. Years ago, a barn fire and a brutal January wind had gone bad. She saved what she could and lost more than she cared to count. Smoke left a rasp in her voice and burned out whatever patience she might once have had for people who treated lives, animal or human, as disposable. These days she poured coffee, flipped eggs, and quietly patched up whatever the mountain blew her way. If anyone on White Rock Ridge knew how to warm 2 half-frozen shepherd pups without killing them with kindness, it was Martha. Evan glanced down the road. The world ahead was nothing but a moving wall of white. His headlights would only carve a narrow tunnel through it. He could turn around, creep back to Cold Crest, and hope the sheriff's station's rattling old heater and thin blankets would be enough for the night. Or he could trust the wood stove at Briar's Outpost, and the fire-warmed hands of a woman who had been standing between winter and fragile lives longer than he had been alive. The choice did not feel like a choice at all. Copy, dispatch, he said. I'm heading to Briar's Outpost. Then I'll make for base when the road clears. Understood, Unit 3. Be careful. I'll work on it, he answered, a ghost of humor in his tone. He slid back into the cruiser, keeping the puppies tucked against him for one last heartbeat before settling them carefully on the passenger seat, still swaddled in his jacket and an emergency blanket from the trunk. One of them let out a tiny sigh, breath misting the cold air. Stay with me. Evan murmured again, so softly it was almost a promise to himself as much as to them. He put the car in gear and turned its nose downhill, into the storm. The headlights vanished almost at once into the whiteout, but somewhere ahead, a neon sign buzzed in the snow, and a woman who refused to give up on small lives was waiting. And as the cruiser rolled forward with 2 fragile heartbeats beside him and the mountain drawing in tight around them, a night that had begun as just another cold call shifted quietly into something else. A turn in the road that would rewrite his winter in ways he could not yet imagine. The storm only worsened as Evan Mercer guided the cruiser down the serpentine descent toward Briar's Outpost. Snow hammered the windshield in relentless waves, turning the world into a shifting blur of white that seemed determined to swallow the road whole. Each gust shoved the vehicle sideways, chains grinding against ice, headlights carving a narrow tunnel in the darkness. The 2 puppies lay bundled beside him, faint breaths fogging the air around the makeshift nest of blankets in his thick patrol coat. Every few minutes he pressed a hand against them, feeling for movement, for warmth, for proof they were still fighting. They were small, but their will to live, a trembling, stubborn thread, was unmistakable. The blizzard parted briefly at a bend, revealing a glow far ahead. A flickering orange smear against the swirling dark. Briar's Outpost. The little lodge clung to the mountainside, like a lantern someone had forgotten to blow out. A neon sign sputtered defiantly above the entrance, its blues and reds muted by the sheets of falling snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, pulled sideways by the wind. Even from this distance, Evan felt a tug of relief. If any place could harbor fragile life in a night like this, It was Martha Breyer's place. Martha Breyer herself was a fixture of White Rock Ridge, known almost as widely as the storms that swept through it. 62 years old, with a broad-shouldered sturdiness built from decades of ranch work, she stood barely to Evan's chest, but possessed the quiet authority of someone who had delivered calves by flashlight, stitched torn dogs in winter barns, and comforted neighbors through the losses the mountain demanded. Her silver hair, eternally escaping from its clip, framed a face mapped with lines earned from squinting into sun and smiling at stubborn livestock. Her mountain blue eyes could cut through excuses and soften around anything wounded. The rasp in her voice carried the memory of a barn fire that had taken more than she admitted, animals she'd raised from birth, and a piece of her confidence she'd spent years stitching back together. Breyer's outpost was her refuge as much as it was the community's, a place where warm meals and warmer silences were offered without question. She had known Evan since he first arrived in Coldest, still wearing the posture of a man fresh out of war, shoulders tight, gaze distant. She'd said nothing about the grief that shadowed him, only poured him a cup of coffee and told him the ridge had room for all kinds of pain. Tonight, that ridge was testing every soul who still had their lights on. Evan pulled into the outpost lot, tires sliding before gripping, and braced his shoulder to push the door open against the wind. Snow blasted into the cabin-like space as he stepped through, and Martha, wiping down the counter, spun around at the sound. Her brows rose, then nodded as she saw the bundle in his arms. "What on God's mountain have you brought me?" she asked, her voice a mix of alarm and unsurprised resolve, the tone of someone who, on some level, expected this mountain to deliver suffering to her door regularly. "2 shepherd pups," Evan said, unwrapping the coat. "Dumped in a culvert, hypothermic, shallow breaths." Martha's hands, large, calloused, unfailingly gentle, immediately went to the pups. She checked their gums, their extremities, their chests, pressing fingers with a precision born from years of saving creatures small enough to vanish in the palm of her hand. "They're cold through," she murmured. "We heat them too fast. We lose them. Their hearts won't keep up." "I know," Evan replied softly. He remembered nights overseas, warming wounded soldiers a degree at a time, watching for the moment hope returned to the body like a slow tide. Martha swept into motion, opening cupboards, pulling out equipment she rarely used anymore but kept ready: heat lamps, warm towels, a shallow basin for lukewarm water. "Set them here," she instructed, "and close that door before we freeze the coffee." Evan shut the door, muffling the storm's roar. The sudden quiet seemed almost sacred. They worked in tandem with few words. Martha adjusted the lamps, turning their glow toward the pups, creating a circle of amber light on the long wooden counter. Evan gently massaged the larger pup's paws, trying to encourage blood flow. The smaller one lay motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. Too faint, too slow. "What happened out there?" Martha asked, her eyes flicking up to Evan as she checked the smaller pup's pulse. "Abandoned car, door open, no sign of the driver." His jaw tightened. Bag was tied shut. Whoever did it wanted them gone. Martha exhaled through her nose, a harsh, unhappy sound. Some people shouldn't be allowed within a mile of a heartbeat. Evan didn't trust himself to answer. The larger pup whimpered softly. Evan stroked the top of his head, feeling the damp fur begin to lose its icy stiffness. "This one's fighting," he murmured. "They both are," Martha corrected. "The little one's just spent more of his strength." Her blue eyes softened as she watched Evan's hands. "You're good with them." Evan shrugged, gaze fixed on the pups. "I've carried things like this before." "You've carried worse," she said knowingly. A silence settled, warm and heavy. He didn't deny it. Thunder cracked outside, though on White Rock Ridge thunder often sounded like the mountain itself shifting its weight. The whole building gave a sympathetic groan. Martha straightened, wiping her hands. "You can't take them to the clinic tonight. Roads will be closed until morning." Evan looked up, instinctively bracing for what she would say next. "Take them to your father's cabin," Martha said gently but firmly. "You've got a stove, blankets, space, and you're the only one stubborn enough to wake up every hour and make sure they're breathing." The cabin. The word hit him like a sudden draft of cold. He hadn't set foot in it for nearly 2 years, not since the winter night when he and Leo had answered a hostage call and only one of them had come back. His father had built the cabin as a sanctuary. Evan had turned it into a sealed vault of memories he refused to touch. Seeing something tighten in his shoulders, Martha asked softly, "You all right?" "No," he answered truthfully, "but they need the warmth." "That's all it takes," she said with a nod. "One good reason." And so, with the storm howling at their backs, Martha packed the pups in layers of warm towels and slipped a small bag of supplies into Evan's hands. An old thermometer, electrolyte solution, a jar of salve she made for frostbitten ranch dogs. "Call if either stops responding," she said. "Call even if you're not sure. I'll come." "You shouldn't be out in this." Martha's grin cracked her sternness like a beam of sunlight. "Evan Mercer, I've lived on this ridge longer than you've been brooding on it. I'll be fine." He almost smiled, almost. He lifted the pups again, their small bodies warmer now, the larger ones stirring weakly. The smaller remained still, but no longer icy. His heartbeat, faint as it was, tapped against Evan's wrist. "Good boy," Evan whispered, adjusting the towel around him. "Stay with me." Martha opened the outpost door. A wave of cold surged in, rattling the windows. "Go," she said, "before the mountain decides it wants the road back." Evan stepped out into the blizzard once more, the wind whipping around him like a living thing. He tucked the pups against his chest and made for the cruiser. Snow clung to his hair, his lashes, his shoulders, but inside his arms, under the layers of warmth, two small sparks of life persisted. When he glanced back, Martha stood framed in the doorway, silver hair whipped wild by the storm, one steady hand gripping the frame, a beacon of stubborn, ordinary hope in a night that had forgotten gentleness. Evan gave a short nod. She returned it. Then he climbed into the cruiser and turned it toward the ridge road that led home, toward the cabin he had abandoned, toward memories he had buried, and toward a night that was no longer just about survival, but about something quieter and far more dangerous: healing. By the time Evan Mercer reached his father's cabin, the storm had risen to full fury. The wind slammed into the tall pines with such force that the branches thrashed like restless spirits, flinging snow in wild spirals that erased the world every few heartbeats. The cabin appeared only when he was almost on top of it, a dark silhouette hunched beneath a crown of ice, its porch buried under drifts that reached nearly to the railing. Evan killed the engine and stepped out, one arm wrapped protectively around the towel-swaddled puppies. The air bit at his exposed skin, cold so sharp it felt metallic. He trudged through the snow, shoulder to the wind, until he reached the cabin door. For a moment, his hand hovered over the handle. 2 years. 2 years since he had stepped foot inside. 2 years since the night that had carved a hollow into his chest that still ached with every winter breath. But the small bodies pressed against him shifted weakly, reminding him why he had returned. He pushed the door open. The interior was exactly as he'd left it, cold, still, draped in the dust of an abandoned life. His father's old rocking chair sat beside the stone hearth, a blanket folded neatly across its back. A shelf of books sagged slightly under the weight of time. The table near the window still held the dent where Leo had set down his coffee mug the last time he'd been here, laughing at some joke Evan couldn't even remember now. The memory punched through him, sharp enough to take his breath. But the pups whimpered again, pulling him back. He lowered them onto a pile of blankets near the fireplace, then knelt to coax flame into the hearth. Dry tinder caught slowly, then flared into a warm, golden bloom that spilled across the dark room. Heat came gradually, chasing away the cold shadows inch by inch. The larger pup stirred first, letting out a groggy, questioning sound. Evan brushed his fur and saw color returning to the pads of his paws. Stronger bones, a stout little body, a stubborn spark in him, even half frozen. "You," Evan murmured, "are trouble waiting to grow bigger." It felt right to give the pup a name, something bold, something that suggested a survivor. "Ranger," he decided softly. "A scout, someone who goes first." Ranger sneezed in response, which Evan took as acceptance. The smaller pup took longer. He lay curled tightly, chest rising and falling in fragile, uneven waves, breathing like a candle struggling not to go out. Evan warmed his paws gently between his palms, whispering a steady stream of reassurance he wasn't sure the pup could hear. When the tiny eyelids finally fluttered open, Evan saw a pair of amber eyes unlike any he had ever seen on a dog before, soft, searching, impossibly aware. They didn't simply look at him, they looked into him, past the layers he wore like armor. A hollow sound escaped the pup, a faint echo of the whimper Evan had heard beneath the culvert. "Hollow," Evan said quietly. "You're hollow." And somehow, the name fit perfectly. As the fire warmed the room, Evan managed to prepare a small space for them, blankets near the hearth, bowls of warm water, a few drops of Martha's electrolyte solution. Ranger lapped gratefully. Hollow sniffed the bowl, then leaned weakly against Evan's wrist, as if drawing strength from touch alone. The hours crawled by. The storm hammered the windows. Evan fed the fire, checked the pups' temperatures as Martha had instructed, massaged their paws to keep circulation going. Ranger responded quickly, his breaths deepening, his whimpers turning curious instead of fearful. Hollow improved, but slowly. Every rise of his chest felt like a small victory. The night deepened into a silence so thick that even the crackle of the fire sounded cautious. Evan lay back against the cabin wall, exhaustion slowly pulling him downward. Ranger curled at his feet and fell asleep instantly, legs twitching as if chasing dream rabbits. Hollow, as always, stayed close. Too close. The little pup pressed against Evan's side, tiny ribs expanding with each careful breath. Evan hadn't meant to fall asleep, but somewhere between feeding the fire and listening to the storm fade into tired murmurs, his eyelids grew heavy. His heart, however, remained restless. And the dream came for him. The same one. Every winter. Every time he closed his eyes on a cold night. Leo, the snow, the gunshot, the body going limp in Evan's arms, the red stain spreading like a silent accusation. He gasped awake, chest tight, breath ragged, heart racing violently as if still running toward the impossible chance to change the past. His hands shook, uncontrollably, shamefully, and for a moment he couldn't tell whether he was in the cabin or back on that frozen roadside 2 years ago. The room spun. Heat and cold collided inside him. Then something warm touched his chest. Hollow. The tiny pup had climbed up onto him, two trembling paws pressing against his uniform shirt, his small body leaning forward with the fierce determination of a creature who had very little strength but chose to give all of it anyway. Hey, Evan whispered, voice breaking. You shouldn't. You need to rest." Hollow's eyes met his, steady, amber, full of something that felt startlingly near to understanding. Then the pup exhaled, a soft sound escaping him, thin but deliberate. No. Evan froze, not because the pup had spoken, but because the sound, whatever it was, carried intention. A response, a reaching out, a refusal to let him drown in the nightmare. Evan's throat tightened. A choked, unexpected sob rose through him, caught, and slipped free. He hadn't cried, not truly, in years. Not when he buried Leo. Not when he shut the cabin door the last time. But now, a palm-sized pup with shaking paws and frost-bitten whiskers had cracked the wall he'd spent. Years mortaring shut. Hollow curled against him, pressing his ear to Evan's heartbeat. Ranger, awakened by instinct more than sound, trotted over and flopped his head on Evan's knee, as if adding his own silent weight to the moment. The storm outside softened. The fire settled into a warm glow. And the man who had forgotten how to breathe without pain finally inhaled fully. When morning came, soft light filtered through the frost-kissed cabin windows. Ranger stretched with a theatrical groan, shook his ears, and bounded toward the fireplace as if the night had been nothing more than an inconvenience. Hollow rose more slowly, his movements gentle, deliberate, but his eyes bright, alive in a way they hadn't been before. Evan watched them with a feeling that frightened him because of how unfamiliar it was. Hope. A small, fragile hope, but hope nonetheless. As he knelt to refresh the pup's water bowls, Ranger bumped his hand playfully. Hollow nudged his wrist again, Tap, tap, echoing the same quiet insistence from the night before. "You two weren't meant to die," Evan murmured. "Not then, not now." He didn't know yet what their presence would awaken. Didn't know how far this thread of miracle would pull him. Didn't know that Hollow's soft syllable was only the first of many. But as the fire warmed the cabin and the snow melted from the eaves, Evan felt the first hint of something thawing inside himself, something long frozen, quietly returning to life. Winter settled over White Rock Ridge the way a great beast settles over its kill, slow, heavy, inevitable. The storm that arrived 3 days after Evan rescued the pups was said by old-timers to be the kind that could peel the skin off the mountain. Even inside the cabin, the air hummed with a strange pressure, as if the ridge itself were holding its breath. Evan rose before dawn, though dawn was only a faint silver bruise behind the clouds. Ranger, already sturdier, louder, and convinced every object was a toy designed for his personal amusement, followed him from room to room with energetic hops. Hollow stayed close too, though in his quieter way, padding silently behind Evan with that thoughtful, observant gaze that made him seem older than he was. The cabin crackled with warmth from the wood stove. Outside, though, wind roared like a creature battering the walls, snow flung sideways in hard sheets. It was the kind of weather that erased trails, snapped trees, and sometimes, if the mountain was in a bad mood, took pieces of homes with it. Evan stepped onto the porch to check the roofline. Snow was piling in dangerous drifts. Ice clung to the eaves in long, jagged spears. The beam above the porch, one he'd been meaning to reinforce but kept putting off, looked bowed beneath the weight. And in that moment, he knew. Storms didn't wait for convenience. "Ranger, stay inside," he called over his shoulder, which, naturally, Ranger interpreted as, "Follow me immediately." The pup burst through the door with a playful bark, paws skidding across the icy porch. Hollow, sensing danger far better, remained inside, ears pinned back. Evan climbed a ladder to knock down the heaviest accumulation of snow. The wind nearly shoved him sideways. He worked quickly, breath steaming in harsh bursts. But halfway across the beam, a deep, splintering groan rolled through the wood. "Not now," he muttered. "Hold together a little longer." The mountain, however, had its own schedule. A crack like a gunshot shattered the air. The beam snapped. Snow and ice crashed down. Evan saw movement, Ranger darting toward him, and he shouted, "No!" But the storm swallowed the sound. The collapsing beam struck the porch, slamming Ranger beneath its weight. Evan jumped down, landing hard on the snow-packed boards. For a moment, there was only wind and the frantic thrum of his pulse. Then, Ranger's yelp, sharp and terrified. Evan dropped to his knees and heaved at the broken timber, adrenaline surging like wildfire. It took every bit of strength he had to shove it aside. Ranger lay trembling, his right foreleg twisted at an angle no living thing should ever endure. "Easy, buddy, easy." Evan scooped him into his arms. Ranger whimpered, burying his nose against Evan's chest. Inside, Hollow paced, ears rigid, eyes wide with alarm. His slender frame trembled, but he did not run. Instead, he pressed close as Evan laid Ranger gently onto blankets near the fire. Evan examined the leg, dislocated or broken, he couldn't tell. What he could see was swelling, pain, and panic. Ranger whimpered again, paw twitching. Evan grabbed his radio. "This is Unit 3. I need assistance at my father's cabin. Injury to a canine, severe weather damage." Static crackled, then Hannah's strained voice broke through. "Copy, Unit 3. I'll notify Martha and Dr. Miles. Stay put." The wind roared outside, rattling the shutters as if trying to tear them free. Snow washed over the cabin windows, dimming the room into a muted gold cocoon lit only by the fire. Evan knelt by Ranger, stroking his head with steady hands, though his heart felt anything but steady. "Hang on, boy. Help's coming." Hollow curled beside Ranger, pressing his tiny body against his brother to share warmth. His face was pinched with worry, his understanding of suffering too sharp for any creature his age. Minutes stretched thin and tense. The storm battered the walls. The fire hissed. Ranger whimpered between shallow breaths. Then, a thud at the door. Evan opened it to find Martha Breyer hunched into the storm. Snow plastered to her coat, silver hair whipping like a flag in the wind. Behind her, riding a small ATV packed with gear, was Dr. Theodore Miles. Dr. Miles was a relic of the Ridge in the best sense, a retired veterinarian in his late 70s, tall and rangy like an old pine tree that refused to fall. His white beard blew sideways in the wind, and his eyes, bright amber behind thick glasses, held a mix of sternness and bottomless compassion. Rumor said he'd once treated a mountain lion with nothing but a flashlight and grit. He moved more slowly these days, but his hands, large and weathered, were as steady as the day he first stitched a torn paw. "Where is he?" the doctor asked, even before the door fully shut. "By the fire," Evan said. They knelt beside Ranger. Martha stroked Hollow's back to calm him as the doctor felt along the injured leg. "Clean break," Dr. Miles murmured. "Lucky, could have been much worse." He looked up at Evan. "He's strong. He's got fight." Ranger whimpered again, pressing his head into Evan's palm. Hollow pressed closer too, trembling. Dr. Miles set his kit down, wrapping gauze, splints, and antiseptic with practiced efficiency. "Hold him steady," he instructed. Evan braced Ranger's shoulders gently. "Easy now, brave one," Martha murmured, voice soft as worn wool. The doctor aligned the bone with a swift, practiced motion. Ranger cried out, a sharp, heart-splitting sound that made Evan flinch. Hollow's reaction was immediate. The small pup lunged forward, pressing his forehead to Ranger's muzzle as if shielding him. His body trembled with such fierce empathy that even Dr. Miles paused. "Hush now," Martha whispered, awed. "Look at him." Hollow leaned forward, breathing shakily. And then a sound emerged, thin, fragile, shaped by breath and trembling effort. "Bra-v." The room froze. Dr. Miles's hands halted mid-motion. Martha's lips parted. Evan's breath caught in his chest. Hollow's voice, if it could even be called that, wavered through the warm cabin air like a miracle still learning how to stand. Ranger's breathing steadied. His heartbeat slowed to a calmer rhythm. His eyes, clouded by fear moments before, focused softly on his brother. The doctor exhaled slowly, as though witnessing something sacred. "Well," he said finally, voice hushed, "I've heard animals soothe each other, seen it too, but I've never heard anything like that." Martha wiped the corner of her eye with the back of her sleeve. "I told you these pups weren't ordinary." Evan looked at Hollow with a mixture of wonder and fear. Fear not of the pup, but of what this meant. Something was happening here that defied every rule he'd lived by. Something fragile, holy, and impossible. Hollow sagged against Ranger, exhausted by the effort, but his eyes, those deep amber eyes, remained fixed on Evan, as if asking a question Evan didn't yet understand. Dr. Miles finished wrapping the leg, the splint snug and secure. "He'll need rest, no running or jumping for at least 2 weeks. Keep him warm, hydrated, he'll heal." Ranger licked the doctor's hand weakly. Martha touched Evan's arm. "You did right calling us." Evan swallowed. "I almost lost him." "And you didn't," she replied firmly, "and he knows that." Outside, the wind began to quiet, as if the storm itself had paused to listen inside the cabin. Evan looked at the 2 pups, Ranger sleeping now, Hollow curled protectively beside him, and felt something shift deep in his chest. Not the old pain, something newer, lighter, frightening in its tenderness. The mountain might break, storms might come without mercy. But tonight, in this fire-lit room, healing had begun long before Dr. Miles arrived, and somewhere, beneath the roar of the storm and the crackle of the hearth, the world seemed to breathe again. Word travels strangely on a mountain. It slips through the pines, rides the wind, and finds its way into kitchens and living rooms long before anyone thinks to speak it aloud. By the end of the week, White Rock Ridge, quiet, snowbound, and usually too distracted by storms to care about gossip, had begun to murmur. It started with a ranch boy who claimed that the little one looked right at him and answered when he asked if the pup was hungry. The boy insisted Hollow's breath had formed a sound, not quite a word, but close enough to make his mother stare at him with a startled, disbelieving expression. Then Mrs. Granger, the widowed school librarian whose stoicism was legendary, visited the outpost to tell Martha that Ranger had rested his head on her knee for just 1 minute, and in that single minute, something inside her, something she thought frostbitten beyond repair, felt warm again. She cried over her coffee, hiding her face in her scarf. Martha simply listened, a knowing softness in her eyes. She didn't repeat the stories, not directly, but she didn't have to. Stories behaved like the winter wind, find one open window, and they rushed in everywhere at once. And so, people began arriving at Evan's cabin. At first, Evan tried to redirect them, claiming he was busy or that the pups needed quiet. But the visitors weren't seeking spectacle. They arrived with careful steps, lowered voices, and the kind of reverence people carried when approaching something they didn't fully understand. He couldn't bring himself to turn them away. The cabin, once a tomb of memories, slowly shifted into a place of warmth, not just from the fire, but from human presence. Families brought biscuits, old ranchers brought blankets, children sat cross-legged on the floor while Ranger learned to nudge toys in their direction. The pup's splinted leg didn't slow him much. He moved with a determined hop-wobble that made even the gruffest men smile. But it was Hollow who drew the most attention. He didn't talk, not the way a child would, but he formed sound with intention, shaping his breath into soft syllables whenever someone was frightened or grieving. Words were too much for him, but meaning wasn't. His amber eyes held an uncanny steadiness, as though he understood how much people needed gentleness. He stayed close to Evan most of all, shadowing him with silent devotion. When Evan taught kids how to hold out their hands so the pups wouldn't be startled, Hollow watched intently. When Evan stoked the fire or repaired loose boards, Hollow followed every motion like a student imprinting a master's steps. Evan couldn't explain it, but he felt it in his bones. Hollow wasn't simply mimicking. He was listening, learning, reaching out. And with every day that passed, the wound Evan carried, raw, aching, shaped like Leo's absence, began to shift. Not heal completely, but soften around the edges, like snow thawing at the rim of a stone. One morning, while Ranger dozed with his bandaged leg propped on a cushion and Hollow licked melted snow from Evan's fingers near the hearth, Martha entered with a letter in her hands. A nervous energy clung to her usual steady gait. "This came addressed to you," she said, offering the envelope. Evan took it, brow furrowing. The paper was thick, the seal embossed with an unfamiliar crest. Rockford Institute for Cognitive Animal Studies, Denver, Colorado. His stomach tightened. "Someone's been filming," Martha said softly, "sharing clips. I should have stopped it, but folks were so amazed, and I didn't know it would go this far." He wasn't angry, only unsettled. He opened the letter. "Dear Sergeant Mercer, we have reviewed the extraordinary footage circulating online regarding your 2 German Shepherd puppies. We believe their behavior merits serious scientific inquiry and offer a non-invasive observational placement at our institute." Evan stopped reading. His pulse thudded. He looked at Ranger, bold, resilient, still limping, but eager to stand guard at any perceived threat. He looked at Hollow, small, delicate, gazing back with soft amber eyes that felt impossibly ancient for a creature so young. Scientists wanted them, to study them, to observe them like anomalies rather than beings. Evan felt the old cage tightening around his ribs. Commands, orders, taking things away. He could still hear the static-laced final call from the night Leo died. "Hold position, Unit 2, hold position." As if obedience were a shield. As if following the rules saved everyone. But he had followed the rules, and Leo had still bled out in his arms. He folded the letter and set it aside. "They're not going," he said quietly. Martha nodded. "I figured you'd say that. But, Evan, people are going to keep asking. Maybe not scientists, but others. You can't hide what's happening here." "I'm not hiding them," he said. "I'm protecting them." The way he hadn't been able to protect Leo. A long silence settled, heavy as fresh snowfall. Hollow nuzzled his hand, sensing the shift in him. Ranger hobbled over too, bumping his head against Evan's knee, as if offering solidarity. Martha frowned gently. "What are you going to do?" Evan didn't know. The cabin was filling with people and expectation. The world beyond White Rock Ridge was beginning to turn its gaze toward Hollow and Ranger, and the more the world looked, the more Evan felt the old fear return. He refused to let anything, science, strangers, institutions, take them. But could he keep them safe, or was clinging to them a different kind of cage? The question gnawed at him for days. On the fifth morning, sunlight broke through the storm clouds for the first time in weeks. The ridge glowed under fresh snow, pale and shimmering. Evan woke early, unable to shake a restless feeling. He looked at Ranger and Hollow curled, together near the fireplace. Ranger's splint was decorated with doodles from visiting children. Hollow slept with one paw resting protectively on his brother's back. They deserved freedom, safety, choice. Evan swallowed hard, then opened the cabin door. Cold air swept in. Frost glittered on the trees. The forest stretched outward in a breathtaking expanse of white, wild and waiting. He stepped aside. "If you want to stay," he whispered, "I'll protect you. If you want to go, I'll let you." Ranger rose first, limping slightly but determined. Hollow followed, thin frame steadying as he stepped beside his brother. They paused at the threshold, looking at Evan with unreadable canine expressions that somehow felt deeply human. Then Ranger bumped Evan's hand once, a gentle goodbye. Hollow tapped Evan's fingers twice with his paw. Tap, tap, a farewell, a promise, a blessing. The two pups trotted into the snow, their footprints small but purposeful. They disappeared into the line of pines, swallowed by the hush of the forest. Evan stood there long after they were gone, snow gathering around his boots, cold biting his cheeks. But it wasn't the painful kind of cold. It was the kind that clarified, the kind that made room for something new. His heart ached, yes, but something deep inside eased as well. They weren't gone forever. They were simply choosing their path, one he had no right to control. He whispered into the quiet, "Be safe, boys." The words carried across the ridge, lifted by the morning wind. And for the first time in years, Evan felt the faintest spark of peace. Spring came slowly to White Rock Ridge, as if the mountain itself hesitated to loosen winter's grip. Snow receded in uneven patches, peeling back from the pines like old paint. Streams thawed in soft trickles. The sky, long a bruised canvas of storm clouds, began to lighten into pale blue. And every morning, the earth released a little more of the frost it had held for months. Life in Coldcrest resumed its quiet rhythms. Roads cleared, shops reopened, and ranchers returned to their fields. The winter storms that had dominated every conversation became stories to compare rather than threats to endure. And Evan Mercer lived somewhere between healing and longing. Without Ranger and Hollow, the cabin felt different. Not empty exactly, but quieter in a way that hummed beneath the surface. Evan no longer woke to Ranger's enthusiastic thumping against the blankets or Hollow's soft, steady breathing beneath his arm. The silence was peaceful, yet tinged with the ache of missing something precious. But he didn't collapse back into old shadows. Not this time. He kept moving. Each morning, he walked down the ridge to Briar's outpost, where Martha seemed more energized in spring than any time of year. She bustled around brewing coffee and flipping eggs, greeting everyone with her gravelly voice and wry humor. The outpost had become a community hub again, strengthened by the vulnerable winter they had all survived together. "Cabin treating you all right?" Martha would ask, without looking up from the stove. Evan always gave the same soft answer. "It's warmer than it used to be." Martha smirked knowingly. "Healing tends to raise the temperature." Evan helped her repair shelves, carry supplies, and fix the loose roof shingles battered by storms. When townsfolk wandered in with questions or burdens, he found he could talk to them without the heaviness that once sat like stone in his chest. He even smiled more, not wide grins, but the small, quiet kind that showed in the corners of his eyes. He volunteered at the school one week, teaching children basic dog handling techniques. A few of the kids asked timidly if the magic puppies were coming back. Evan simply said, "When they're ready," a truth he held close. But at dusk each evening, after walking home through the pine-lined path, he always paused at the edge of the clearing near the cabin. The last sunlight would stretch across the ridge, warm and golden, and Evan would stare into the tree line, quietly, steadily, stubbornly, hoping for two silhouettes to emerge. They never did. Not through March, not through April, not through May. Yet every day he felt them near, somehow. Like a heartbeat he could no longer hear, but still remembered the rhythm of. One early morning in June, the mountain shifted again, not violently like a storm, but gently, like a giant waking from a long sleep. Evan stepped outside with a mug of coffee, the steam warm against the cool, dawn air. The world was hushed, wrapped in soft gold. The pines rustled with the faintest breeze, and somewhere beyond them, a bird trilled a melody that sounded like the first true promise of summer. He took a long breath, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. Then, tap. He stilled. Tap, tap. The mug nearly slipped from his hand. "No," Evan whispered, disbelief clawing at his voice. He crossed the porch in 2 strides and pulled open the cabin door more quickly than he intended. The hinges squeaked. The early sunlight spilled in. 2 silhouettes stood framed against the glowing horizon. Ranger was larger now, his coat shining with health, his muscles filled out along his shoulders and haunches. His right leg, the one that had once been broken, stood firm and strong beneath him. He held himself with new confidence, like a guardian who had discovered his purpose during his time away from people. Beside him stood Hollow, slighter, elegant in his quiet presence, with amber eyes that had deepened to something breathtaking, gentle, ancient, knowing. A sprig of pine rested between his teeth, fresh and green. Hollow walked forward and dropped the sprig at Evan's feet. A gift, a greeting, a declaration. Evan's throat tightened so suddenly it hurt. Ranger pressed against his leg with a joyous rumble, tail sweeping the floor like a broom made of pure happiness. Evan dropped to his knees, both hands reaching to touch them, as if making sure they were real and not dreams shaped by longing. "Boys," he breathed, "you came back." Hollow lifted his head. His chest expanded slowly, and then, in a soft, breath-formed whisper, "Home." The sound was not perfect, was not fully human, but it was unmistakably intentional. The word rang through the cabin like a small miracle unfurling its first wings. Martha had arrived at that moment, climbing the path with a basket of supplies. She stopped dead in her tracks, one hand flying to her mouth, her glasses fogging from tears before she could even remove them. "Oh," she gasped, voice trembling. "They came back." Ranger rushed to her, nearly knocking the basket from her arms. She laughed, a bright, unrestrained sound Evan didn't think he had ever heard from her before. Hollow walked to her slowly, gently placing his forehead against her knee. Martha froze, then knelt, stroking his head with shaking fingers. "You smart, stubborn miracle," she whispered. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the ridge. For a moment, the world felt impossibly gentle. Later that day, Evan filled out paperwork at the sheriff's office, requesting official conversion of his father's property into a community sanctuary. Hollow Haven, a refuge for animals and people seeking peace. He worked with Martha to plan spaces for rescued dogs, spaces for veterans struggling with silent battles, spaces for families needing a few days of quiet after life had struck too hard. The cabin would become the heart of it all, a hearth for the hurting, a safe harbor for the lost. Ranger took naturally to the role of guardian. He patrolled the clearing proudly, ears perked, tail held high, as if announcing to every creature in the forest, "This place is protected." And Hollow was different. He stayed close to Evan, observing each person who visited. Elderly ranchers, grieving parents, lonely drifters. Hollow approached them all with a softness that made grown adults cry without knowing why. No one taught him this. He simply chose it. As for Evan Mercer, the man who once believed winter had frozen him solid, he felt something else entirely blooming inside. A new beginning, shaped by 2 small lives, returned to him not out of need, but out of love. Some miracles arrive quietly. Some walk on 4 paws. Some heal wounds we don't realize are still open. And some return to us, only when we have finally learned to receive them. In the quiet ending of this winter journey, we are reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or bright angels. Sometimes they come softly through a loyal dog who chooses to return home, through a storm, through a man who learns to forgive himself, and through the gentle strength God places in ordinary hearts. In our everyday lives, we all face seasons of fear, doubt, or loneliness. Yet God walks beside us even then, guiding our steps, sending comfort in small, unexpected ways, and reminding us that no one is ever truly forgotten. His grace reaches us through the moments we rarely notice, a voice of compassion, a spark of hope, a reminder that healing is still possible. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need encouragement today. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts and type Amen if you believe in the quiet miracles that God sends into our lives. May the Lord bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please support the channel by pressing subscribe so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, love, and redemption.